Our second scripture reading, our gospel lesson for today, comes to us from Matthew chapter 13, verses 31 through 33, and continuing with verses 44 through 46. If you'd like to follow along in your pew Bibles, I'd invite you to do so at this time. It can be found on page 795. Let's all listen for God's word to us today. He put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all the seeds, but when it has grown, it is the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour, until all of it was leavened. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which someone found and hid. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. On finding one pearl of great value, he went and sold all that he had and bought it. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Did I ever tell you about the time that someone was snoring through a sermon that I was preaching? I may have mentioned this to you before. I don't recall. It was years ago. It was in a different congregation. I was maybe 7 or 8 minutes into the sermon, and suddenly I heard a low, rumbly breathing sound. I thought, is that someone snoring? Yes, that is someone snoring. I tried to ignore it, but it started getting louder and louder, and pretty soon the people close to that person sitting nearby were starting to giggle. Then the row in front of the person started to giggle. Then the row behind started to giggle. I should have just stopped preaching at that point and waved the white flag. On another occasion, this was a different person this time, a very kind elderly lady came through the line after worship, and she made a point right off the bat to apologize that her husband had been asleep in worship. He wasn't snoring. I didn't notice her. I hadn't noticed he was asleep. She said, you know, he's been having the most difficult time sleeping at night. We think it's his medication, Ben, but when he comes here to worship and you start preaching, he gets the most peaceful 20 minutes he's had all week. I hope you won't be offended. None taken, I replied, none taken. I mean, if church can provide the most peaceful 20 minutes in a person's week, then it's doing something good, right? It's doing something good. Of course, even with all the good that many churches are doing these days, and all the good that our church, that Westminster is doing these days, on a national scale, it's not really bringing the crowds through the doors, right? I'm sure you've heard the statistics. In the past 25 years, 40 million Americans have stopped going to church. In our own denomination, membership has declined 62% during the past 40 years. Jessica Gross has written a series of articles in the New York Times this summer exploring the topic of why this is the case, not just for churches, but across religious faith throughout America. In her latest article, she writes, when Sydney Schnurr's husband was diagnosed with cancer right in the middle of COVID, her local hiking group in Colorado showed up for her right away. Just a few days after word of his illness got out, someone in the group set up a meal train for the days her husband was in treatment, and fellow hikers offered to drive them on their long trips to the hospital. Sydney Schnurr, who is 70 and describes herself as a recovering PK, that is a recovering preacher's kid, was raised Episcopalian and said she'll never go back to the institutional church. But her hiking group, which is locally run, feels like a church, she said, because the people in it take care of each other. You know, that's the kind of story that raises some fundamental questions about church. What is God's church for? What makes us unique? What can we offer that no one else in our society can offer? And what does that mean for the future of the church? I raise these questions because of the parables that Jesus provides for us this morning. The 13th chapter of Matthew is chock full of parables, all of which I think are related to what it means to be God's church. In our text for today, we heard a series of very short parables, rapid-fire metaphors, if you will. The kingdom of heaven is like, the kingdom of heaven is like, the kingdom of heaven is like. And when Jesus says kingdom of heaven, I don't want you to think of heaven in terms of where we go after we die. Jesus is talking about how we live before we die. Jesus is talking about what it means to be God's church. Now, you remember the parables, right? The first two parables are about growth. A seed that becomes a tree, yeast that transforms dough into bread. You remember how Jesus described it. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all the seeds, but when it is grown, it is the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. At first blush, the meaning of that parable seems pretty straightforward, right? As one biblical scholar puts it, the kingdom of heaven starts very small. One man, Jesus, preaching in an out-of-the-way corner of the world. But like a tiny seed developing into a mighty tree, the kingdom will expand to magnificent size. You know, I heard that parable this week and I thought of Westminster. It's not a bad description of what's happened to our church in its history, right? We are now a congregation of over 2,000 members. In our 76 years, we too started from something very small. An idea that some members at First Presbyterian Church in Greenville had, or better yet, an idea that the Holy Spirit planted like a seed in their souls. And they left their home church. And what those charter members started way back in 1947 with a tent has grown into something that most likely none of them would have ever imagined at that time. It's almost as if Westminster is a perfect example of this morning's first parable. But let's pause for just a moment there. Does anyone here know what happens to a mustard seed when it's planted? It's okay if you don't. Here's what one Bible dictionary has to say. A mustard seed is a plant, an annual herb with varieties from 2 to 6 feet in height, and it produces a small number of yellow flowers. That does not sound like a large and glorious tree to me. Where are the birds making nests in its branches? What's going on here? The church in which I grew up back in Michigan is going to celebrate its 60th anniversary soon. It got started about 15 years after Westminster got started. 10 years ago, when it was celebrating its 50th anniversary, it invited the Reverend Dr. Ron Byers, the pastor who baptized me back in the 1970s, to preach in that pulpit once again. In his sermon at the anniversary celebration 10 years ago, he said the following to his former congregation, my former home church. When I became the first full-time pastor here back in 1968, I did not expect to see what I am seeing now, more churches being closed than opened. I really thought the respected Protestant churches would get a second wind, he said, and grow deeper as well as stronger as the years went by. I had never once seen a church building turned into a bar or a condominium, and I never expected to. Then he went on. But in the 21st century, we who still gather for worship have become the odd ones, the ones swimming against the stream. Where is God in all this? We're out on a limb here, he said. If God and the church are on intimate terms, what's going on with all this mainline membership church decline? That's the question that most churches in our denomination and other mainline denominations are asking these days. What in the world is going on? In fact, Ryan Burge, are any of you familiar with the name Ryan Burge? Ryan Burge is a professor at Eastern Illinois University. Dr. Burge has done extensive statistical research on religious and political trends in American life. And he did a deep dive recently into our own denomination's membership trends. And he sent out a tweet on Twitter earlier this spring that said there is a fighting chance that within the next 20 years, the PCUSA will be forced to dissolve. Within the next 20 years, dissolve? I'm not there. I'm not there. I do think things are going to change for our denomination. The strange thing for all of us is that what's happening in so many Presbyterian churches out there is not what you and I are experiencing right here. Look around you right now. Look at this sanctuary. On the 30th of July, it's still summer and we're full. Westminster is very fortunate to find ourselves in an odd position because unlike so many of our sister churches, we are still a growing church. It does not feel when you walk through these doors like we're out on a limb. And yet, it is also very true that the world is changing outside our walls, and it would be a huge mistake to imagine that we can somehow lie back on our laurels and cool our heels and take our growth for granted. We cannot do that. All of which brings us back to the first question I asked. What is unique about being God's church? What do we have to offer that no one else can offer? Getting back to Ryan Burge, in a recent article he writes, increasingly, religion has become the enclave for those who have lived a, quote, proper life. College degree, middle-class income, married with children. If you check all those boxes, the likelihood of you regularly attending church is about double the rate of folks who don't. This is not just troubling for churches, he says. This is also troubling for American democracy. Religion, at its best, is a place where people from a variety of economic, social, racial, and political backgrounds can find common ground around a shared faith. It's a place to build bridges to folks who are different than you. Unfortunately, he goes on, it looks like American religion, and this extends well beyond our own denomination, is not at its best right now. Instead, it's become, he argues, a hospital for the healthy, an echo chamber for folks who did everything right, which means that it's seeming less and less inviting to those who did life another way. Do I think, he concludes, that houses of worship have done this on purpose? Generally speaking, no, he says, but they have also not actively refuted that narrative. Now that is a provocative argument, And it begs an interesting question. What would it look like for Westminster, our healthy, growing congregation of open minds, open hearts, to actively refute that narrative? Let me be the first to say that in some ways we already do, and you know it. We are not a red church. We are not a blue church. What are we? Yeah, a couple of you just shouted that out. What do you get when you mix red and blue? Purple. Good, good. A purple church filled with people from both sides of the political aisle and a few aisles in between. Around town, we may be known as a progressive church. I prefer to say that we are a hospitable church, and that our vision of open minds, open hearts, is not just descriptive, but prescriptive, and gives us something to continually strive for and live into. Of course, once we say that, we need to focus every day on that pillar of hospitality and on that promise to be open. You've heard me say it before. How many of you are looking forward to having a donut after church today? Yeah. I want you to make a point to introduce yourself and welcome somebody you don't know before you reach for that donut. Because that is the practice of Christian hospitality. We need to move, I think, from that big picture, hospitality, to the little picture, to the particular picture, to the faces of the world and the need around us, and to ask ourselves, what do our neighbors in Greenville truly need from us? For example, you heard me ask in a sermon just a few months ago what it might look like for people who are formerly incarcerated to attend worship here, or for us to be intentional about the ways in which we welcome families with children who have disabilities or developmental differences when their families come here. Do people who are transgender feel welcome within our walls? If we don't know the answer to that question, how can we find out? Would someone who is struggling to pay their bills on a weekly basis feel like there is a place for them in these pews? Or how about those who have no church background whatsoever? Or how about those who do have a church background, but they've been hurt by the church or just bored by the church? They didn't just fall asleep one Sunday, they fell asleep 20 Sundays, and they decided to leave. And now they've come back and their faith is hanging by a thread. How are we doing? Not just welcoming those people, but seeking out these children of God who may be too uncomfortable to find us and walk through our doors on their own. I once heard a colleague of mine, the Reverend Tom Lamb, tell about when he was a newly ordained minister 40 years ago. At that time, Tom met a man named Harold Steele. Harold was working at Attica State Prison at the time, where he ran 5 different groups for men who were incarcerated there. The recidivism rate for Attica at that time was 85%, but for the men who were part of Harold's ministry, the rate was 15%. So my colleague, Tom Lamb, newly ordained, accepted Harold's invitation to join him one day on a visit to Attica. Lamb says, I was a bit unnerved when they slammed the door behind me and the guards led us inside the walls to the room where we would meet with 20 or so inmates. When everyone had gathered, Harold introduced me to them as the Reverend Thomas Lamb, to which I responded, you can just call me Tom. Lamb goes on to say that the discussion that day was no G-rated deal. There was confrontation, accountability, acceptance. But from the start, he said, one of the inmates was staring me down. Every time I would look his way, he would be staring back at me. When it came time for one last comment, he finally spoke up. He looked at me and he said, "Tell me something. Just call me Tom. Can you be the Reverend Thomas Lamb if I need you to be? Because I don't need no pals. I need a pastor. Can you do it? Just Tom?" Lamb goes on to say that Harold Steele, the one who invited him to come, talked to him about that on the ride home. He told Tom that those men did not need informality from him. They needed him to be the very presence of Jesus Christ. What is it that the church can offer the world that no one else can offer? Exactly that. The very presence of Jesus Christ. It is what we are called to do. It means for a church like Westminster, growth is a good thing. It is not the most important thing. The most important thing is welcoming like Christ, being generous like Christ, loving like Christ, forgiving like Christ, serving like Christ, befriending the poor and the powerless like Christ, being willing to carry a cross for absolutely anybody, just like Christ. Now I know, some of you are eager for me to get to those last two parables. I can just sense it right now. Don't worry, I don't have another 20 minutes for you. But I do want to mention those last two that we heard today. You see, in them, Jesus describes a person, an imaginary person, who treats this way of living like someone who has found treasure hidden in a field, like someone who has found a pearl of immense value, and this imaginary person gives away, sells all that he has in order to live that way, in order to live and love like Jesus Christ. Now, I said Jesus thought of an imaginary person at that point. Maybe. You know who I think he was thinking of? Look around this room. That's who Jesus was thinking of.